Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, je me présente, je suis David Eidelman, je suis vice-principal santé et affaires médicales et doyen de la faculté de médecine de l'Université McGill. Au nom de l'université et de sa faculté de médecine, j'aimerais vous souhaiter une bienvenue chaleureuse. So I'm David Eidelman, I'm Vice Principal Health Affairs and Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, and I'd like to welcome you to this wonderful session. First of all, I'd like to thank the Honourable Jane Philpott, Minister of Health for Canada, and the Honourable Aaron Motsoaledi, Minister of Health for South Africa, who are both here with us today, along with members of Parliament, the Honourable Mark Miller for Ville-Marie, le Sud-Ouest, and Île-des-Sœurs, the Honourable Karina Gould, Burlington, the Honourable Mike Lake from Edmonton, Wetaskiwin, and the Honourable Nicola Diorio from Saint-Léonard, Saint-Michel. Welcome. We also have special guests and esteemed panelists who will be introduced to you very shortly, including Mike Dybul, Executive Director of the Global Fund, Lucika Ditiu, Executive Director of Stop TB Partnership, Peter Singer, Chief Executive Officer of Grand Challenges Canada. And starting tomorrow, health leaders from around the world will assemble here in Montreal over the course of 2 days to set funding levels during the Global Fund's Fifth Replenishment Conference. The Global Fund, as most of you know, is a 21st century partnership organization designed to accelerate the ends of AIDS, TB, and malaria, the big three infectious diseases, by 2030. It's an extraordinary collaboration between governments, civil society, the private sector, and people affected by the disease. Since its inception in 2002, together these groups have made amazing strides, saving no less than 20 million lives. And with a target to raise $13 billion US, I'm a very proud Canadian to know that our country has already stepped up to the plate and pledged 785 million Canadian dollars, representing a 20% increase from what it provided in the last round of funding. As a dean, I'm particularly excited about our research contributions, and Canadian researchers are making a major contribution to the fight against these three diseases, leading the way in the identification of antiretroviral targets, the promotion of treatment as prevention strategy, which is a Canadian idea, and the development and evaluation of new diagnostics, the treatment of HIV and hepatitis co-infection, as well as taking leadership to help influence policy and advocacy. I'm particularly proud of the work done here at McGill and at our affiliated healthcare institutions by an outstanding cohort of 100 scientists who conduct leading-edge research on infectious disease and related subjects. Over the last 2 years, McGill's Faculty of Medicine has specifically ramped up its commitment and increased its investment in global health as an extension to our basic science efforts in infectious disease. Alors McGill est honoré de participer à l'effort collectif par des événements comme celui-ci, par les travaux d'avant-garde de ces scientifiques au laboratoire et sur le terrain, et par l'engagement de ces professeurs qui parcourent le monde pour contribuer à l'élaboration de politiques avec des leaders en santé mondiale. In the fight against TB, AIDS, and malaria, McGill researchers are working on the cutting edge of new technologies, new medicines, vaccines, and importantly, new ways of thinking about delivering healthcare. You're going to get to hear more about all of these subjects throughout the evening, but first I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, who is the Honourable Mark Miller. A native Montrealer, he is a two-time political science graduate of Université de Montréal and holds a law degree from McGill University right here. Focusing on international and commercial law, he worked globally before returning home to Montreal, and last year was elected as Member of Parliament representing the riding of Ville-Marie, le Sud-Ouest, Île-des-Sœurs, which is the riding in which we sit right now. Il a été élu président du caucus du Québec et siège au Comité permanent des affaires étrangères et de développement international. Mesdames et messieurs, accueillons l'honorable Mark Miller. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in welcoming the Honorable Mark Miller.
Merci au doyen Edelman pour la réception et bienvenue ici à McGill. Comme vous savez, j'ai été en droit ici, ils m'ont pas laissé en médecine, heureusement. C'est un plaisir d'être parmi des gens qui sont visiblement plus intelligents que moi, mais avant de vous féliciter, il faut que vous vous souveniez que je suis un politicien, puis le seuil est assez bas. Alors, objectivement, vous êtes très intelligent. Alors, merci de m'avoir ici aujourd'hui. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge our presence on Kanien'kehá:ka, or Mohawk traditional territory. This is not a simple symbolic gesture, it's a very real gesture. Some of our First Nations suffer from unacceptable rates of tuberculosis, and while we're doing our best to put a best foot forward for Canada where it doesn't necessarily benefit us directly, there is work to do at home. And it isn't but a few decades ago that the sunrooms in country houses were used to treat tubercular patients. And so that history is very present in our minds when we think about what we're doing today. But this is about helping other people in the world's most needy. And I'm glad to do it. It's an honor to be part of a government that's dedicated to that. Dr. Pai, Dr. Motsoaledi, Minister, distinguished guests, thank you for having me here today. I claim McGill as my riding. It's an ambitious claim, but I learn well from Mayor Coderre. You just claim everything and it falls into place. Hope this isn't on the record because I'll be hearing from him. It's with the type of innovation that we're putting forward today and effective partnerships across public, private, community, and academic sectors that we can reduce mortality rates for the most vulnerable in this world, in the areas that have the least amount of access. These three diseases are treatable, and until 2030, we're trying to save about 20 million lives, if my numbers are right. Canada recognizes our progressive role in the world on matters that change lives for the betterment of all. It's therefore my pleasure to introduce Minister Philpott, who not only is an excellent choice for Minister of Health, she has first-hand knowledge of a number of these diseases, having worked in Africa, lived in Africa, seen the diseases firsthand. I've traveled a bit, so I've only seen them as a relatively wealthy tourist. But we have an excellent minister and I can testify to it personally. She is one of the hardest working ministers in our caucus and in the cabinet. She's done exceedingly good work in the area, specifically of medical assistance in dying. It was key in making sure that legislation got through. We're not in the business of investment banking, but if I had to give a year-end bonus, it would be to her. But we signed on to something that's much lower and much more noble, and Minister Philpott is filling that role admirably, and everyone in our caucus supports her and admires her. Unfortunately, she didn't graduate from McGill Medicine, it was Western, so she's not perfect. There's still hope, though. Again, this is an initiative that, as we start the fifth replenishment of the Global Fund, it is a dedication to the world's neediest in the areas of malaria, TB, and AIDS, and Canada is uniquely positioned to shepherd that, along with his partners that are contributing. And without further ado, I won't bore you more, but I want to introduce Minister Philpott for the main part of the presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Mark is a true comedian, so you might actually have been hoping he would stay here. Anyway, it is lovely to be here in McGill. It is true that one of the errors of my ways is that I have not managed to get a degree from McGill, but as you said, hopefully I might have a few years left in me, and maybe there'll be a post-political renaissance and I can come to McGill and see if I can get further educated, and appropriately so. But what a beautiful, beautiful setting. And thank you to everyone for hosting this event, and thank you, Dean Eidelman, for your very kind words and welcoming the world to your beautiful facilities here. Great pleasure to see my colleague, Minister Motsoaledi from South Africa. Real honor that you were able to come and join us for this event, and so good to see. I won't point out so many other familiar faces, but it's lovely to be reunited with several friends. on this very exciting event for us as a government and as a country to be hosting the world for the Fifth Replenishment Conference. And I'm honored to take part in today's panel, which is going to be very interesting, and you've managed to gather such an interesting group of academics and policy experts and community leaders, and I'm sure we're going to have some great conversations. I wanted to share some thoughts on how our communities, how our country can in fact play the role that we ought to in addressing these three major epidemics that we continue to face globally: AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And as you attend the events today, and I suspect many of you will be attending further events tomorrow, you're going to hear a lot about numbers, about the devastating impact of these diseases. And we often focus on the numbers in hopes to somehow be able to grasp the enormity of these issues that are before us. The numbers are shocking, and we hope to shock ourselves into action. But you and I know that people are not numbers, and infections are not simply statistics, and deaths are much more than data. As Mark pointed out to you, I spent a decade of my life working in the wonderful country of Niger in West Africa in a rural hospital. And so when I think of AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria, I don't think about numbers. I don't even think about a virus and a bacteria and a parasite. I think about faces. I think about people's eyes. I think about people that I saw in each of those illnesses at varying stages, and many of them having lost their lives to these conditions. I thought particularly as I was preparing this talk about a girl that I wanted to tell you the story of, and I actually went into my photo albums and printed a picture of her. I don't feel comfortable sharing the picture because I didn't get her permission, but I wanted to tell you her story, in hopes that you also would think about the stories that you know, and as you go about these activities in the next couple of days, that you would have people in mind, individuals that you have known who have been touched by HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. The story of the girl I wanted to tell you about was a young woman, 13 years old, who I met in Niger. In 2005, I was there working with Médecins Sans Frontières, and I used to have a little pathway that I would take from the hostel where I was staying to the MSF office in Zinder, which is out in the eastern part of Niger. And as I walked along that pathway, I would pass a compound where it was always teeming with children, and the kids would run out to see me as I walked by and want to touch me and shake my hands and hold my hand for a while as we walked along the street. One day they asked me to come into the compound. A couple of their grandmothers were there and a huge mass of children. I have a photograph of the children. And that day I took some pictures of the big gathering of children and the two grandmothers under a tree. The 13-year-old girl said, "Would you please take a picture of me by myself? I've never had anybody take a picture of me all alone." So I took a beautiful picture of this young girl and went on my way to work. 2 days later, when I was going through my routine and walking past the very same compound, the children were waiting for me and rushed out to see me with some news. They said, "Remember our sister who you took a picture of, especially under the tree 2 days ago? She died last night. She had developed a fever, went to hospital, and died of malaria." 2 days earlier, I had taken a stunning photo of this girl. And when I think about malaria, that's the girl I think about. And when I think about AIDS, there are particular people who come to mind, some of whom have happy stories, some of whom had good outcomes of our interactions, some of whom weren't able to be saved. But it's important for us to remember that this is much more than data that we're talking about. It was around the same time in 2005 when I came home from that stretch of time that I spent with MSF in Niger, that I read a book by a wonderful writer named Adam Hochschild, and maybe some of you have read some of his works. And one of his fantastic books is called Bury the Chains. And I was in a state where I was really searching for how on earth were we ever going to respond to these enormous epidemics that we're facing in the world. And the book Bury the Chains is a book that looks at the ending of the slave trade 200 years ago, focusing in particular on the story of what happened in Britain. And there was a paragraph toward the end of that book that has stood out to me and has really continued to speak to me about what it's going to take for us to be able to confront these challenges. At the end of that book, Adam Hochschild reflects on the fact that to the British abolitionists, the challenge of ending a slavery in a world that considered it fully normal and acceptable was as daunting as it seems for us today when we consider challenging the entrenched wrongs of our age, the vast gap between rich and poor, the relentless spread of nuclear weapons, the multiple assaults on earth, air, and water that must support future generations, the habit of war. He said none of these problems will be solved overnight, or perhaps even in the 50 years that it took to end British slavery. But they will not be solved at all until people see them as both outrageous and solvable, just as slavery was felt to be at that time. So to me, that's what we haven't quite figured out how to do, to make Canadians, to make our neighbors, to make people around the world realize that the pandemics of AIDS, the reality of malaria, and the reality of tuberculosis in our world is outrageous, but it's more than outrageous, it's solvable. And those are the facts that we have to face as we go into this replenishment conference. How are they outrageous? To me, and I've followed the data on AIDS for a long, long time now, since I first heard about it in first-year medical school many years ago. More than 2 million people were infected last year, and over 1 million deaths. In fact, over 3,000 people dying every single day of AIDS. That is outrageous. Malaria, 214 million cases last year, almost 500,000 deaths last year. Tuberculosis, a third of the world's population currently infected. How much more outrageous can you get? But let's bring it down closer and think about Canada, because we need to look not just beyond our borders, but we need to look inwardly and see what we're actually facing and how outrageous it is. In Canada, there are still 50 new infections every single week with HIV. What's worse than that is that that number has actually not substantively changed in the last 2 decades. We continue to see vertical transmission from parent to child, 3 cases last year, of a reality that was absolutely preventable in a country that has universal health coverage, and somehow we were not able to provide adequate prenatal care to 3 mothers who ended up passing HIV on to their children. When we look at tuberculosis, we think about the rates in Indigenous populations in Canada. The 2014 data show us that in First Nations populations, the rates of tuberculosis are 33 times higher than for non-Indigenous Canadians. Even more outrageous than that, if you look at Inuit populations, as you may know, 375 times higher than non-Indigenous populations, the rates of tuberculosis. Absolutely outrageous. So how is it solvable? It's solvable through tools that are absolutely at our disposal. It's solvable through collaboration. And all of you who have been involved in this business know that we are never going to get anywhere without collaboration. We have to harness the power of collective efficacy. Individually, even in our individual institutions, yes, we can make progress in HIV, TB, and malaria, but it's only collectively and collaboratively that we can actually contemplate with sincerity the end of these epidemics. I, like my colleague Mark, am proud of the fact that Canada is doing its part. I was so pleased in May when our Prime Minister announced that Canada would increase its support to the Global Fund by 20% to help bring an end to AIDS, TB, and malaria. And as Mark alluded to, The Global Fund has already helped save 20 million lives. And with the additional $13 billion that we all hope to be announcing tomorrow, it's estimated that actually what the Global Fund will be able to do is save an additional 8 million lives and prevent, even better, 300 million new infections and reduce the burden on health systems. In Canada, we've targeted investments toward HIV and TB in particular, and we've increased preventive efforts to identify who needs treatment and care. That includes so many excellent projects, but one of the ones that Canada is known for, and in fact when we were in South Africa this summer talking about AIDS in particular, but obviously you can't talk about AIDS without talking about tuberculosis, and people noted the fact that Canada has invested $85 million in the Stop TB Partnership that you're going to be hearing more about shortly, and the TB Reach initiative to support innovations in tuberculosis detection and care. And there are so many examples of other ways that Canada is working to collaborate with other partners around the world. When it comes to tuberculosis, I look to examples like working to assess the effectiveness and uptake of short-course TB therapies through the work of the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. And so that brings us to the second thing that will make this solvable. First, through collaboration, but second, I believe that it's solvable through research. And again, we have so many Canadian examples of how we are contributing in positive ways to research. I think about the Public Health Agency's own Dr. Frank Plummer, who is this year the recipient of the Gairdner Award for his groundbreaking research in understanding HIV transmission and his leadership in the Canadian National Microbiology Laboratory with pivotal roles that he has played in a number of infectious conditions, including SARS and influenza and the Ebola epidemic. Through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which I suspect many of you in the room are engaged with, the Government of Canada has to date invested more than $237 million in research related to HIV, and hopefully there will be much more to come. The National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg is saving lives by facilitating HIV drug resistance testing and enabling capacity building throughout the world. Canadian researchers are also working with the Gates Foundation to better understand the HIV virus. And of course, I must note some of the achievements, some of the many achievements here at McGill, including the TB Centre right here in Montreal that's developing tools like the Let's Talk TB book. The third area that I would mention in terms of how this is solvable beyond collaboration, beyond research, is the considerable emphasis that we've had in our international conversations recently to focusing on key populations. And this has come out of some of the recent UN declarations on the matter of how we will address the AIDS pandemic. You know already that the history of these pandemics is that key populations have been disproportionately affected, and they're different in different locations around the world. In Canada, we need to confront the reality that there are specific populations on which we need to focus. Men who have sex with men and other LGBTQ individuals are still the largest part of the most vulnerable populations. Indigenous Canadians, as I've already talked about, are vastly disproportionately affected. Sex workers, people in prison, people who use drugs. These are the people and the individual groups that we need to be able to talk about, where we need to face the fact that we will not see an end to AIDS or tuberculosis in this country, nor to AIDS, TB, and malaria around the world until we address issues like equity, access, and human rights. In all of these key populations, we have to face the reality of stigma and discrimination, which fundamentally increase susceptibility to infection and continue to act as sometimes insurmountable barriers to prevention, treatment, care, and support. Within these key populations, we have to find ways to accelerate the use of the available preventive tools, and there are so many. I'm still stunned at how we can't seem to find a way to accelerate the uptake of so many tools that are at our disposal. Pre-exposure prophylaxis now, I'm happy to see that we're making some progress, but we have much more to do to make sure that the appropriate people have access to PrEP. Treatment as prevention, a proud Canadian concept, education, and harm reduction, which is something that's very important to me. So these scourges are solvable through prevention, through treatment, and sometimes through cure. But time is not necessarily on our side. We face increasing rates to antimicrobial resistance, for example, and it will continue to battle against us. So the last thing that we need is the political will. And that's why I'm proud to say that Canada is determined, that our government is firmly committed to be a good partner, to be a collaborator on all of the efforts that those of you in the room will undertake. Personally, in my department, through the Public Health Agency of Canada, through the First Nations Inuit Health Branch, through my collaboration with provinces and territories, through working with providers, non-governmental organizations, community service organizations, we are determined to bring an end to AIDS, TB, and malaria. Thank you for inviting me here today. I look forward to engaging with the panel now on talking about how Canada can help, and together, I believe, we can end it for good. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and our students. My name is Madhu Pai. I'm the Director of Global Health at McGill. I can't tell you how excited we've been since the day we learned that Canada and Montreal is hosting the Replenishment Conference. And we instantaneously began the process of conceiving and pulling off this event. And so to me, it's a dream come true to have so many global health leaders in town today, this week, and in McGill University right now. At McGill, we may not actually realize how much of a heavyweight we are in the area of infectious diseases. Sometimes we just don't even acknowledge our own strengths. We have the McGill International TB Center, the McGill AIDS Center, the Dick McLean Center for Tropical Diseases, McGill Institute of Parasitology, MUHC's IDIG program, the WHO Collaborating Center in Research and Training in Parasite Epidemiology and Control, as well as many basic scientists working in microbiology, immunology, and pathogenesis, working in TB, HIV, and parasitic diseases. Between us, I think Dave Eidelman mentioned this, we have more than 100 faculty members and trainees and students working in this area. So for us, it's so exciting to see Canada's leadership in global health. I mean, I was in Geneva about a couple of months ago at the Stop TB Partnership with Luchika, and Luchika stood up, and the first thing she said was, "This is a very good time to be from Canada." And I said, yes. I was like jumping on my seat up and down. That's exactly the word she used. And I couldn't be more proud of the leadership Canada is showing in global health in general, and in particular, TB, HIV, and malaria. We really want the Replenishment Conference to meet its target, and we want to see these epidemics go down. Our students couldn't be more excited. About 10 of them have done videos on how they are ending TB, and we posted all of them on YouTube, one every day leading up to this conference. So it is my great privilege and pleasure to invite the rest of the panelists. Thank you, Minister Philpott. Thank you, Mr. Miller. Can I now have Dr. Mark Dybul, the Executive Director of Global Fund, to come up to the stage. I won't spend too much time on introductions because I don't want to cut into the actual panel, but I will just say one thing about Mark. The dynamism that he's brought to Global Fund is just absolutely incredible. And in general, people working in HIV are much more dynamic than people working in TB. Luchika is one exception. Luchika is one exception. And if you compare my wife who works in HIV and me, you will see the night and day difference. HIV folks are supremely ambitious for HIV. They will do everything, and TB, like, we are fine with a 100-year-old microscope. We will live with a 100-year-old vaccine. And HIV folks are like, no, we want the best of the best for our patients. We're trying to change that, okay? The next panelist, we would like to invite Luchika Ditu, the Executive Director of Stop TB Partnership. No, Luchika is trying to change the narrative on TB and bring the much-needed ambition we need in the TB field. Dr. Peter Singer, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Peter is the CEO of Grand Challenges Canada, and you'll hear more about how GCC, funded by the Government of Canada, is contributing to TB, HIV, and malaria. And I would love to now invite our own leaders in the area of TB, HIV, malaria. Marcel Baer, director of our McGill International TB Center. Dr. Mark Weinberg, director of our McGill AIDS Center. Both centers have been around for many years and doing very meaningful work in this area. And to represent our malaria researchers, we have Dr. Philippe Gros, Vice Dean of Research at McGill University. Philippe also does basic science research in malaria. We don't have a malaria center, but as I mentioned, we have several people working in the area of parasitic diseases, and Philippe will summarize them. So my first question for the panel, and please use the mic. Is the mic on? Yes. So we will start off with Mark. I know that he may have to leave soon. It's a crazy busy time for the Global Fund, and we are still very thrilled that they could find some time for us. So the question for you, Mark, is let's hope by the end of this week you hit your target of 13 billion. We really want you to meet that target. And all of you are contributing tonight, whatever you can to that pot. Assuming the replenishment targets are met, what's the actual strategy to convert dollars into ending the 3 epidemics? How do you see dollars translating into actual strategies? What's the implementation strategy for the Global Fund?
Thank you, and it's really great to be here. Thank you, Minister, for the work you and your government's been doing, and certainly the Prime Minister for the leadership he's shown on this. And it's great to see Minister Mozzoleta here. You all get to hear from. He's one of the heroes in all of this, and good friends from a long time. Mark Weinberg and I have known each other too long, and Peter also. Canada's got such depth. It's wonderful to be at McGill. We were so excited you wanted to do this. I actually am an academic at heart. I was a scientist, which is how I got to know Mark before I became a bureaucrat. And it's always nice to be in an academic setting. And really, it's awesome to see the students here, which is what this is all about. You will begin some stuff. We've begun some stuff. But you actually will be the generation that will or will not end these epidemics. And so your engagement is just awesome, and having this event here is spectacular. It's exactly where we should be. We should be here in this setting, even though it used to be a chapel, I'm guessing. But it's fantastic. So how do you take money and make it real? Well, the way you do it is by going country by country, district by district. So there's no such thing actually as a global HIV epidemic. There's no such thing as a global TB epidemic or a malaria epidemic. There are microepidemics all over and in each country. And you can look at maps now and see that. We're better at understanding that. Chances are, at least in my view, we probably always had that topography of epidemics, or at least in the last 15 years, but we didn't understand it. And so the first thing is to stop looking at things as global or even national and really get down to where a new infection's starting. And that's the key, really. And I make this point over and over again, and sometimes I get in trouble, is we have got to stop thinking the way we thought 15 years ago and think in a different way. So 15 years ago, it was really about just pouring money in. Literally, you could spend money almost any way you wanted to, and you would have an impact. And it was about response. It was about getting the resources and showing that you can have impact. Now we have to shift our thinking to ending an epidemic. And that thought process is actually fundamentally different. How you act to end an epidemic is fundamentally different than how you act to respond to a crisis. And that's the key. And if we don't change the way we think, we'll keep doing things in the same way. If I hear one more time about a silver bullet, I literally am going to slit my wrists. There is no silver bullets to any of this. It is complex, microepidemic by microepidemic, understanding what's driving each microepidemic, the factors, who's at risk, and then look at the evidence base for what the response should be in that microepidemic. And the reality is that despite all the phenomenal science and gains we've had, we don't know a lot. And so that's where the art of public health comes in. And it's public health. It's not randomized controlled trials. It's actually taking the trials that we have, taking the evidence that we have, and making our best call, and then following it in depth to find out how things are going and adapt readily. And that's innovation. And I have to say, when we talk about innovation, we talk mostly about new products, and we absolutely need new products in all of these things. But a lot of the best innovation in the last 15 years has been in district by district, civil society by civil society, community by community, coming up with how do you take those things that were designed, those new technologies, and get them to people who need them. And we're learning more and more about that. There's phenomenal work in South Africa about adherence. TB Reach does amazing work at active case detection. And it's local innovation. It's local innovation at how we do these things. So the answer is, in general, the way to solve these problems are to actually go community by community, use the data that we have, use the data to drive decision making, then collect the data on how we're doing and respond in a rapid way, and then you'll end epidemics. But you have to go where the new infections are. You can't just take broad sweep things and do things the way and think the way we were doing 15 years ago. Now, beneath that are two things I just want to emphasize before turning over, because I think are really important. And this is a shift again over the last 15 years. 15 years ago, we set up a lot of parallel systems, and we actually had to show that you could invest billions of dollars and get impact. No one actually believed it. I mean, the vast majority of the public health community was opposed to antiretroviral treatment, for example. People didn't believe that you could spend billions of dollars a year in HIV, TB, and malaria and have an impact, because we hadn't had a very good track record overall in development and global health. So we had to show that. But now the reality is, for the long term, it has to be part of the system, and that means strong systems. And when we look at countries that are behind in their results, they're also behind in procurement and supply chains, in quality and use of data. Quality programs are way behind on quality and improved quality, and understanding that there's difference between one site to another, and understanding why and how you improve that. So it's the systems pieces that have got to be there. And then the second is something that the minister talked about so eloquently, which is the human being and the human rights component of it. And really the most at risk for these diseases, these three in particular, but actually almost any major disease right now is the vulnerable populations. And in the case of HIV and TB, more so than malaria, but it's truly extraordinary. They're unique infections. We cannot end either of them unless we become better human beings. We cannot end either of them until we are inclusive and have an inclusive human family, until we accept people. I'm openly gay, until we accept people who are of whatever their sexual orientation, whatever the color of their skin, are they urban poor, whoever they are, to accept them with the dignity and worth, not just accept them, but embrace them for the dignity and worth that each of them has. And that's a pretty cool thing, actually, if you think about it. There are very few infectious diseases where that's the case. To end these two, we actually have to become better human beings to give flight to the better angels of our nature. And that's a really cool opportunity. So to all of you students, take it on, because we're not going to end these epidemics. We're going to push as hard as we can. It's going to be you that ends them. And so we're so delighted to be here with you, and because you're going to take everything and make it happen. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Mark. I'll just give you the story here is that anytime we mention global health on campus, students just line up around the block. They may not even know what it is. They want to do it. They want to save lives. They want to get involved. They want to actually do something meaningful. And this is just a sign of times. So global health, I think all over North America, is the most interesting area to study. And we are starting to see the same thing at McGill as much as any other school. Luchika, can you please use the mic, please? Not that you need it. You are pretty articulate. I've known you for more than 10 years. So tell us a little bit about Canada's engagement in the Stop TB partnership. I remember when I was on the board about 7 years ago, we always had a Canadian government representative on the Stop TB board. And now the TB Reach Wave 1, Wave 2. So tell us how critical Canada's support has been, and where do you see TB Reach fitting into the overall end TB strategy?
Yeah, so thank you. First of all is that I Facebook, I tweeted, I said, I'm sorry I'm Romanian, we all need to be Canadians. And I said that before the Global Fund this week, and that's because indeed people roll their eyes when you are with Americans because of Donald Trump, they roll their eyes when you are with people from UK. When you are with a Canadian, people become suddenly friendly and interesting, so thank you very much. The second point, you know, I follow always my interest. I'm really happy to hear the students are interested in global health. Stop TB Partnership looks so much for interns and people keen to help. Please, you all come, because in TB, we desperately need energy, enthusiasm, and innovation. And now I go to Canada, and it's not, I don't want to look backwards that much. I want to look forward, but I want to be very honest. So in TB, Mad was right? We deal with a disease for thousands of years, and I kept saying that if Robert Koch comes out of his grave and he goes to my own country, leave aside others, which is Romania, and it's a EU country, he will not be very shocked. He will be shocked by the phones, by the cars, by flying and stuff, but he will not be shocked on how we deal with TB, because we still use the microscope. And we have a vaccine which is 100 years old, which doesn't work. And we have some drugs there and there, but there is nothing spectacular. So we need vision. And I have to say that Canada was the one that started, together with the US government, the Global Drug Facility in the year 2001. And now in 2010, funded and started TB Reach. And TB Reach, it's all about innovation in service delivery. And it's all about what the minister was saying and what Mark was saying. You know, you have an issue and you know you cannot find all the people with TB. Forget about the guidelines and the global picture, the regional, even the country one. Your issue is an issue in your community and it affects some people. How can you find the people, put them on treatment and cure them? And what was amazing with the first rounds is when you realize how much you obtain if you give the wings and the power of imagination of people to tailor the interventions to their local conditions. You probably read about some nurses in Boston going last week in bars to find the TB patients. We also bought horses and donkeys in Lesotho to be able to go after their patients. It was not easy because we were at that time hosted in WHO, and to buy horses and donkeys while in WHO was not really exactly what they looked at. But that's what was needed. These people didn't need more microscopes because it didn't help to have the microscopes or the drugs if you don't have the means for the people to go there. And here I go to the people, and that's what TB Reach is about, because unless we think about people, and Minister, you were amazing when you said, I think about eyes and faces of people. Unless we put ourselves in the shoes of these people, and we realize that we all have barriers in reaching some things, right? Let's admit it. If you are part of a key population or a vulnerable group, there will always be difficult for you to reach the service, the health service. That's why the health service needs to make an extra step towards you. And sometimes the public health sector cannot do it. There might need to be some NGO doing it. In other places, there might be the private sector. So if there is no collaboration and tailored to the really environment in which we are, in which you operate, you will never have the success that is needed. So TB Reach is pushing really agenda forward in trying to find innovative ways to find the vulnerable people, diagnose them and treat them till you cure them with tuberculosis. And I have to say that I'm extremely grateful for the collaboration with you, Madhu, and it's not because we are here in this awesome room. Dean Edelman, thank you for hosting us here. But it's because we hope that McGill and your team will, and our colleagues from the TB Center will help in becoming like the knowledge managers. We need to spread the knowledge. You know, it's not enough that we get great stuff if we are not able to push it forward. So we hope that, and we will have a very formal way of doing business between TB Reach and McGill, to be the ones spreading the word, documenting it, monitoring it, and learning from it. The last point that I want to make is about the need to learn from what we know and the need to dare more. TB is a shame And you heard the minister that TB is today killing more than HIV/AIDS. There are 4,400 people dying every day of tuberculosis according to the estimates of WHO. You know, we can all eat the best food and we can do all the jogging in the world and do all the sports and be fit. We are all at a risk here, and because as far as we breathe, we are all at risk of getting TB. And I think personally that having children these days dying of TB or children these days dying of MDR-TB, because we have a cure, it's a 6-month treatment which is extremely cheap, it's really not acceptable. So I really add my voice to the one of Mark in saying, you know, you are all here, a young generation, the ones that will take it forward. We speak all about ending TB, HIV, and AIDS by 2030. TB is not about ending. We will not eliminate or eradicate. There will still be a lot even beyond 2030. But it will be you to make the difference. We will push. But for TB, I'm sure we will not get there. I will finish this job by not being extremely satisfied. But what is the most important is for you to challenge why not. And yes, we can do it. And say all the time, we have to end this because we cannot, as human beings, be defeated by some stupid viruses and bacteria. Thank you.
Thank you, Luchika. So we are very thrilled to partner with TB Reach, and we've already hired a whole bunch of students and young researchers who will be working on the TB Reach project with Stop TB Partnership. Peter, so Grand Challenges Canada, funded by the Government of Canada, is all about innovation. And TB, HIV, and malaria have very much been on your radar right from the time you launched. Can you tell us a little bit about Canadian innovations in this space and how you're nurturing those innovations?
Thank you, Madhu. And let me just make sure we're on the same page on a couple of things. Some of the best global health scientists, researchers, and innovators are right here at McGill, right here in this room. True or false? True or false?
We're being modest.
True. I want to hear from you. True or false?
True.
True. Tomorrow, we absolutely must and will reach the $13 billion target for the Global Fund because that's the most immediate goal. True or false?
True.
False.
Where's the e-check button? Last one, innovation is required to end it for good.
Absolutely true.
Okay, so now let me do what you asked me to do, which is give some examples of Grand Challenges Canada's innovations. We've actually supported more than 100 innovations funded by the Government of Canada in HIV, TB, and malaria. Give you a couple of examples. Why don't I start with a couple here at McGill? One of my favorites is called Mystery Patients for TB, and that is examining the prescribing behavior of private healthcare providers in India, which is a hotbed of TB, finding how it's sometimes not that fantastic, and then using innovation and these mystery patients to improve it. And who did that work? Madhu. Let me give you a second example. HIV Smart is a mobile-based app which helps in terms of self-counseling and leads people towards testing and treatment. Who did that work? Nikki. She's sitting right there. Two fantastic examples which go to your point. Doesn't have to be incredible technology. Those are innovations in clinical practice and in patient self-management. Next example. And this goes, Mark, to your point about reaching vulnerable groups. In this case, I want to talk about girls. We supported a researcher called Njuguna, Dr. Njuguna in Kenya, who did a randomized trial with $100,000 in girls in Kenya that showed pretty definitively that text messaging, regular text messaging around HIV testing significantly increased the use of HIV testing. Great example of an innovation. Let me give you another example. This isn't limited to the bug itself. We supported a fantastic researcher, Ethel Reda, in Uganda, who did a randomized trial, again for $100,000, which pretty definitively showed that people with HIV who were depressed, a randomized trial of community-based essentially community health workers doing cognitive behavioral therapy versus usual care, which is not much for mental health, improve the mental health of people with HIV in Uganda. Really interesting study. Of course, sometimes the technologies are very important. I'm proud to say that early on, we supported a couple of the most significant TB testing companies. Molbio, big tech in India, Ustar in China. These are really leading national companies that are moving towards TB testing. And Minister Motsoaledi is the longest serving health minister in Africa. And it's wonderful that you're here. In South Africa, we supported a team at WITS who was modeling where they should place the Gene Expert machine to decrease the time to testing of people with TB. And so just to round off with one other example, in malaria, there's some fantastic malaria researchers in the country, even a couple that aren't here, Philippe, I think, like your colleague Kevin Kane, who's doing important fundamental work, because in malaria we always think about the deaths, but the biggest burden might not be the deaths. The biggest burden might be the many, 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 many children who have severe malaria, not even cerebral malaria, and whose brains will never recover. So some really important neuroprotective work by Kevin Kane. For example, does arginine, which is in peanuts, protect the brain from severe malaria? And there's also some economic work that shows that that's a very, very significant burden. So there's some examples, and let me just close with a proposal, and it goes along the lines of the points that you were making, Minister, that you were making, Mark, about reaching vulnerable communities. We've talked a lot about women and girls. We need to talk much more about our own indigenous communities and reaching them in an era of universal sustainable development goals. But Mark, to your point, you know, the rights of LGBTQ communities in many of the countries that receive funds from the Global Fund are not secure. I mean, just a month ago, the police raided the Pride Parade in Uganda. Compare that with our Prime Minister proudly marching in Pride Parades in Canada. And he's probably marched in more Pride Parades than any other head of state. But if you think about that contrast, you have to ask yourself, as Canada is moving down the LGBT agenda domestically, is there a contribution that it can make globally to stimulate innovations to protect LGBTQ rights, which of course will stimulate access to testing, treatment? I mean, for want of a better word, think about an LGBTQ grand challenge that's stimulating social innovations on LGBTQ rights, supporting innovators in countries themselves to advance that agenda, using social innovation probably, and that's an example of something we can do to double down and further move forward in the future. So innovation is critical. The job at hand is to get the $13 billion for tomorrow. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to McGill for the incredible work that you're doing in global health. I started with the world-class researchers that are in the room. Charles Larson has actually been hugely helpful to GCC in particular in our internal processes, but I want to end with the young people and the students, because your point is exactly right. And that's why Canada is so focused on youth, including at this replenishment conference. And so to all the young people in the room, I want to say thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for enthusiasm. Thank you for your commitment. It's what keeps this whole thing going, and it's what will make us successful tomorrow in the short term and in the midterm to end it for good through innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. As Minister Philpott mentioned, we have the traditional Tri-Council research, CIHR, which has been funding HIV research, global health work, but it's actually quite refreshingly nice for us to have a dedicated global health funding agency, which is GCC. Because sometimes we do struggle to convince CIHR reviewers why work in Botswana or Namibia will have relevance to Canadian health. And so it's not that easy, although our researchers have done extraordinarily well with foundation grants and CRC and project schemes. But to have a dedicated global health track through GCC has been extraordinarily helpful for many of us. Over to you, Mark. So Mark is the director of our AIDS Center, which has done really pioneering work in HIV/AIDS for many years, right from the identification of 3TC as an antiretroviral drug to more recent work on prevention and the whole notion of cure. So Mark, can you just quickly walk us through the biggest Canadian contributions in HIV/AIDS research and where you see McGill fitting into that?
Well, I think McGill has really played a very important role over the years. You mentioned the role of our own laboratory with regard to the development of 3TC as an antiviral drug, something that we're very proud of. And I want to pay tribute to the chemist from McGill, Professor Bernard Belleau, who really was the genius behind the synthesis of that compound. But, you know, we've contributed in many other ways as well. Our own lab was instrumental in the development of tests to monitor the phenomenon of HIV drug resistance, and we were among the groups that independently discovered that HIV would quickly manage to become resistant to virtually all of the drugs that we use in therapy. So that's also something that we're very proud of. Of course, many McGill scientists are focused on helping to find a cure for HIV, and McGill scientists such as Professor Jean-Pierre Routy is very involved in this kind of activity, as are many others, including ourselves. I would also like to state that the concept of treatment as prevention is extremely important, and I would be remiss not to pay tribute to my friend and colleague, Professor Julio Montana of the University of British Columbia and St. Paul's Hospital, for really pushing this agenda forward in a very, very important way. But I think also when people ask me personally, Mark, what is it that you are most proud of in terms of your career? I would really say that it was the fact that I was the president of the International AIDS Society way back in 1998 and played a pretty important role in regard to bringing the International AIDS Conference to Durban for the first time, not the last conference that we had in 2016, because believe it or not, in the year 2000, there were at that time already approximately 12 million people infected in Africa, many or most of whom were in South Africa, and only 7,000 of those had access to antiretroviral therapy at that time. And that conference really made a difference because it was attended by thousands of journalists who wrote stories about how the world was such a terribly unfair place and how could we go on living with each other unless we found a way to provide antiretroviral drugs to the millions of people for whom HIV would be a life sentence without having access to therapy. And of course, this is where the Global Fund has also made such a very important difference. So thanks to Mark Dybel and to our own Government of Canada and to Minister Philpott for spearheading our increased contributions, which are so very important. I do want to say that I think other countries also have to step up at the plate. The Global Fund cannot and should not rely only on the well-established Western democracies to do this. Countries like Russia and China
and India
and others have been derelict, and it always amazes me how many countries throughout the world never manage to be short of funds when it comes to wanting to buy more and better munitions, but are not able to come up with funds to do the right thing in regard to global and public health. So let me also just say that we have made enormous progress, obviously, on the treatment side throughout the world. And this is a wonderful thing. We still have a way to go in this regard, but fortunately, the newest crop of drugs that we now have, which are the integrase inhibitors, really are working so much better than anything that we ever had before. And we have to hope that this kind of drug will be widely available throughout the world sooner than later. And finally, and in closing, I would just like to state that it's a little bit unfortunate that other diseases such as Zika, while extremely important, have really managed to knock HIV, TB, and malaria off the front pages of newspapers throughout the world. And, you know, we live in a world where people too often want to say, hey, that HIV and malaria and TB, that's all old stuff. We've all heard of that. And, you know, there really isn't that much new going on, is there? And it's the new kid on the block, even though, as has been pointed out many, many times, the numbers of cases, the numbers of fatalities, the numbers of people who really cannot look forward to a bright future, there's just no comparison. HIV and TB and malaria are really so important by comparison, and I think we cannot lose sight of that. We have to hope that journalists throughout the world also don't lose sight of some of these vital facts and address issues of public health with a degree of realism that I think is essential to our being able to accomplish our goals.
Thank you, Mark. And compared to that very important IAS conference in Durban versus this year's IAS conference in Durban, you were there, Minister Philpott, is a night and day change, and we're going to hear from Minister Motsoaledi on how South Africa has managed to turn the tide, not only in HIV, but also in TB, with dramatic investments in the last few years. So we're very excited about Minister Motsoaledi's presence here. Philippe, can you walk us through, as Mark did, the highlights of the most important Canadian contributions in malaria research and control, and where you see McGill contributing in this important area?
Sure. So malaria, as TB and HIV, as presents critical challenges. We don't have a vaccine, despite an enormous, worldwide effort to generate one. We have good drugs. Artemisinin came online maybe 20 years ago, but now there are many reports of artemisinin resistance appearing in Cambodia and other places. And really, there's nothing else. Right now, artemisinin is the standard of care, and it's very, very effective, despite efforts by Medicine for Malaria Ventures and so on, the Gates Foundation. The pipeline is working its way, but it's slow. And then, of course, there is resistance to insecticides in the Anopheles vectors. So the challenge is there, and they're very significant for the number, for the reason that were discussed. As opposed to TB and HIV, in Canada, we don't really have a lot of malaria. We don't have the right mosquitoes or the right weather, but we do get malaria back from travelers and so on. But despite the fact that this is sort of a quote-unquote foreign disease, Canada has actually made very, very significant contribution to mostly basic research in many aspects of malaria. And this is what I'd like to sort of, point out some of the major achievements in the past sort of 5 or 6 years. And Peter's already mentioned a few from Kevin Kane's group in Toronto. But if we look, for example, at the Structural Genomics Consortium, also in Toronto, which is a consortium with Oxford University, and that involves the Gates Foundation and also multiple pharma partners, Al Edwards and his group has generated high-resolution crystal structures for many parasite molecules, which can then be used for structure-driven drug design. So this is, really state-of-the-art approaches to trying to develop new and effective drugs against the Plasmodium parasite. This is a unique worldwide effort that's anchored in Ontario. McGill itself has had over many years an interest in using genetics to understand the relationship between humans and the malarial parasite. And this research, supported by CIHR and other agencies, has really sort of blossomed into the identification of particular proteins in the host and in the parasites that are critical to drive pathogenesis, starting from understanding what are the differences that are specific to individuals that are more vulnerable or more resistant to the disease. So this whole area is really a Canadian, if you want, piece of real estate that we should be proud of and that we should continue to support. Peter has alluded to also implementation of novel technologies such as genomics and proteomics and metabolomics that are funded by Canadian agencies such as the Canadian Fund for Innovation that allow buying infrastructure which then gets seeded into some of the top research laboratories, including, let's say, Kevin Kane's lab in Toronto, where they have developed very sensitive markers for serum-based markers to identify those children that will develop very, very severe disease, including cerebral disease, and it's really critical to identify these individuals so the treatment can be initiated quickly in those individuals. Canada has also contributed to the drug discovery pipeline funded by the Gates Foundation, otherwise known as Medicine for Malaria Ventures. So several of the molecules that are part of this pipeline, including reformulation of existing drugs, come actually from Canadian laboratories, including some here at McGill. Of course, we have researchers here at McGill in the Institute of Parasitology, at the Research Institute of the MUHC, in the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, that study various aspects of the parasite biology, including identification of virulence factors, mechanisms of drug resistance, immunogenicity determinants that are important for, ultimately, for vaccine design, and so on and so forth. And finally, we have also both in Montreal, but also in Peter's Rodman Center, spent quite a bit of energy with concrete results in research in public health and health policy related to malaria that spans the whole spectrum of diagnosis, intervention, environmental factor, global warming, and so on and so forth. I guess in closing the biggest gap in our knowledge, so in Canada we've demonstrated that we can do a lot of very significant high-level research. One of the challenges is how do you take all this enormous amount of really beautiful information, scientific data, and actually translate this into outcome for populations that are affected. And I think the Global Fund is a really important toggle to actually achieve that.
Thank you, Philippe. I remember attending your meeting in June. Peter was here, and Tim had organized it. A massive number of people came to Montreal for a malaria conference, and I was impressed that we had such serious bench strength in the area of malaria. I think the decline in malaria mortality is globally considered one of the biggest success stories, from millions to about 500,000 a year. But it's probably too premature to take a foot off the gas on that, just because malaria deaths are going down. Like you mentioned, it's not just not dying, but if the child grows up with a mental deficit or has serious problems in schooling because of repeated episodes of malaria, or anemia, chronic anemia because of repeated episodes, that's a serious amount of work still to be done. Marcel, you're not last because TB is the lowest priority. That'll never happen here at McGill. So tell us a little bit about the TB Center, Canadian contributions in TB, and where you think we can help end the TB epidemic.
Okay. First off, it's quite daunting and humbling to hear such eloquent speakers and such dynamism. And Madhu is right. I think the TB community tends to be a bit lower key. So it's great to meet Luchika to realize we have a different way forward. I wrote down a few thoughts, so this is not exhaustive. So if anybody here has done TB research who I don't name, I apologize in advance. But I'd like to highlight some achievements that Canadians can be proud of in the different spheres, or what we call in the CIHR, the different pillars of research, from fundamental to clinical to public health research. And just sort of two examples of each. So in fundamental research, one of the key things that I learned through my training came from people like Philippe Cros and Emil Scamini, is that TB and other infectious diseases are genetic diseases. And the way that the pathogen interacts with the human actually varies from person to person. I think it bears some reflection that we needn't conceive of one-size-fits-all solutions. When we try to develop a vaccine, not everybody's immune system is going to respond the same. And how we then develop our products and how we then push them forward, and even how we evaluate them, we're going to have to take that into consideration. On the flip side of the vaccine work by my group and others, studied, you've heard of the BCG vaccine in passing as a vaccine that doesn't work. And one of the things we may have done was the post-mortem, where we studied the devolution of BCG vaccines as they were just kind of passaging around and around in labs around the world. It's quite fascinating to then try to figure out what it was and see if we can work our way back to something that would be more credible and have greater impact. In clinical work, where we also have to, put the patient face in perspective, some of the biggest work that I see coming out of Canada is the understanding of how to diagnose this latent tuberculosis infection, so that we can try to really figure out how to interrupt and intervene on the 2 billion people. Who are the people who should be treated and not? A lot of the work from Madhu, from Dick University, trying to understand how are the tests we had applied if you've been vaccinated or not, how can we modulate our algorithms. And then Dick Menzies has taken the lead on a really massive undertaking, the first major trial of shortening the treatment. So it's not enough to diagnose these people, you have to intervene. And anybody here who's taken 9 months of isoniazid is going to say, maybe I'd like to take 4 months of rifampin. And if he can show that these are equivalent, that could have a really transformative effect on the landscape of what we do with the billions of people who are infected. When I think of public health research, I think some of the Canadian leads are something that sort of comes out of the lab and is translational, and we've heard about the importance of complementary and interdisciplinary research. Canadians were the first to use whole genome sequencing to study TB transmission. And this was a paper from Jen Gardy from the BC CDC and the New England in 2011, and it's the same technology we've applied in Nunavik. And it reminds me of what Mark was saying earlier in his presentation. What this has shown is that if you take a village with a tuberculosis outbreak and you map it down to the resolution of base pair by base pair, even within a village there are microepidemics. And even in northern Quebec, where you'd say there's epidemic TB in the Inuit, there's 10 villages that don't have TB, there's 4 villages that do. There's no transmission across the villages, which is very reassuring, but there can be multiple epidemics within villages. And so you really have to dig down and figure out what exactly are the situations there. And I think whole genome sequencing is merely a modality to get at this issue, which is where do we really want to invest our resources to make the biggest impact. So in the future, I see Canada contributing kind of in 2 conceptual spaces. Clearly, we need to go to the source of TB, where most of the cases are, and this is work that Kevin Schwartzman and Dick Menzies modeled a few years ago in the New England paper, saying, is it cheaper to treat immigrants when they come to Canada, or is it cheaper to invest in TB control in Mexico and in the source of our immigrants? And it's hard to know, and of course we have to do a bit of both, but Canadians can have a major contribution to the global TB control effort. At the same time, I think Canada is in this really unique position where we're a high-resource country with a relatively low burden of TB, but these pockets of epidemic spread. And I think that Canada could actually take a lead in finding strategies to go from control to elimination and lead the end game of the TB epidemic.
Fabulous. Thank you, Marcel. I think I recently saw that California, where you and I trained, Marcel, has a California TB elimination plan. Just California. And I keep wondering, how on earth are they going to pull it off, given the massive number of immigrants who come into California? But regardless, I think we need a Canada TB elimination plan. And at least here, we should wipe out the disease for good, with the fact that our borders are very much open. And yesterday I was at the Gates Foundation in Seattle. Everyone there is planning to migrate to Canada after November. So I think we may have to build a wall. But just to tell you that and get them to pay for it. So I like the idea of a Canada TB elimination strategy. At the very least, in our Aboriginal communities, we can do much more than what we've done so far. So our team has been working in Nunavut, Gonzalo and others, and Howard New, who's in the audience, they're working in Nunavut. We're working in Nunavik. So we can team up and do something here. At the same time, we've got to continue our work in global settings like India and South Africa, as we're doing. So now I want to open the floor to our students. I want to give our students working in TB, HIV, and malaria the first shot at asking questions. Some of them have already volunteered to ask questions. Can I have Robin Lee, who recently finished her PhD with Marcel and is now a postdoc, to ask a question? Go ahead, Robin.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations and for being here today. So the WHO has set a target of TB elimination for 2050 for low incidence countries. Canada, as most people here know, is one of those countries. And yet, as Minister Philpott said, there are certain subpopulations that have much higher amounts of TB here in Canada, in particular the Inuit, with rates of TB higher than any other Aboriginal population and higher than many developing countries. So from a collective approach, what can we do to try and eliminate these pockets of TB within our country and actually reach that step?
So maybe, Dr. Philpott, would you like to take a crack at this challenging problem of Aboriginal TB?
Well, thank you for the question. Congratulations on your work, and I hope you will continue. I think many of the answers have already been alluded to by some of my colleagues here. And obviously, we've already heard about some of the fantastic research that's being done, and we're hearing that a lot of the challenge is getting that research actually into practice. But I would say even before that, I've learned that the first answer to every question I get asked is social determinants of health. And the second answer is what Mark alluded to, and that's equity. So, which is in fact one of the social determinants of health. So, I think in general, I'm so proud of the fact that Canadians, I think and hope, and it's almost you're frightened to hope too much, but I get the sense as I talk to Canadians across the country that we are waking up to the fact that we have done some horrible wrongs and that we have a tremendous amount of work to do in reconciliation, in realizing the fact that Indigenous peoples in this country have, for longer than we want to admit, had not had proper access to the education that's necessary to be able to be healthy, to the economic opportunities to be able to be healthy. And when it comes to something like tuberculosis, you think about housing and so many other determinants of health that all of you in the room could elucidate. So I think part of it is that whole fundamental structure that has nothing to do with medicine at all, that needs to be addressed. And then I think, again, Mark really talked about the fact that some of it is the public health systems and the structures that are in place. The fact that we've led siloed approaches to whether it's tuberculosis, AIDS, malaria, diabetes, all kinds of other conditions that we seem to think that we're going to be able to solve without actually addressing comprehensive primary care and public health and population-based health. So there is no easy answer to your question. It's comprehensive. It's having the political will to do all the things that the people up here have talked about, and it's all of us being able to put our particular talents and energy and determination behind it. But it certainly is possible, and I certainly would like to rise to your challenge to say Canada is absolutely well placed to be able to say we can control tuberculosis, to be able to reach some of these programs that, or some of these particular communities where there are extremely high instances, should be absolutely doable. And you can keep holding me to account for my role in that. I will continue to work hard on it.
Thank you, Minister Philpott. I'll now call on Caitlin Anstedt, a PhD candidate in the McGill AIDS Center, to ask a question. Caitlin?
Thank you, and thank you everyone for your wonderful insights. So my question is related to the AIDS pandemic. If we think about all the strategies that are put forth to helping solve the pandemic, what would you say is the single most unprioritized strategy that's important, and how do we change that? How do we bring more attention to these underutilized strategies?
Who wants to take that? Mark? Go ahead.
Maybe I'll start and then the scientists can weigh in. This gets to my slitting of the wrists comment. There is no one strategy. It depends on who's most at risk and what community they're in and how the community responds. So if you're in an adolescent girl, young women epidemic, you're going to respond in a different way than if you're in a intravenous drug user epidemic, or if you're in a different part. You can look at Kenya today and you have 3 different epidemics, completely different epidemics in different places with pretty much nothing in between from an epidemic standpoint. So what are you going to do in each one of those areas, and what's different? We really have got to get away from the silver bullet, what's the one thing? The one thing is what we did 15 years ago. You know, let's do something we had never done before, treatment. We've got to switch. Yes, treatment as prevention is important. So is male circumcision. So is PrEP. So is cultural changes around girls and women, which is the outrageous thing that's causing the epidemic to be out of control in Southern Africa, where we could lose control of the epidemic. You have to put together the pieces, and if we keep looking for the one thing, we will be here in 15 more years having the same conversation. The one thing is to end the epidemic, whatever the epidemic is, find out what the drivers are, use the best evidence we have to go after them and make a difference. But there is no one thing. And I'm so adamant on that, as you can tell.
Thank you. Could we... Yes, go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
Mark was alluding to, who might also comment on this topic. And I agree, there is no one thing. We have to make sure that we have a multi-pronged approach. But I would be remiss not to state that there are quite a few papers that have been coming out in the scientific literature over the last year or so, with others soon to appear, that make the point that there are far higher rates of drug resistance developing in developing country settings in regard to HIV than is the case for the rich countries of the world, such as our own. And one of the main reasons for this is that we have now, in almost all settings, come to use integrase inhibitors, which are our newest and best drugs, across the board in first-line therapy, with few exceptions. And as a consequence, those drugs work so well without hardly any drug resistance developing that it's something that we just don't see very much any longer. And this is really a wonderful thing for our patients in Canada and in other Western settings. And I think we have to strive to make sure that integrase inhibitors become available in developing country settings as quickly as possible, or we will continue to see much more drug resistance moving forward, along with the transmission of drug-resistant variants of HIV, which is an absolutely horrible thing. So I think the drug companies have to be coerced into making their best drugs available at, very low prices for people who do live in developing countries, and then the international agencies and our governments, such as our own, have to be part of this process to make sure that the best drugs that we now have available in Canada are also available in very, very short order throughout the developing world, where they are so desperately needed.
Thank you, Mark. Can I invite Stephanie Kusikovics, a master's candidate in the Institute of Parasitology? Please go ahead.
Hi, think you all had some real interesting and inspiring things to say. So my Global Fund is primarily focused on the implementation of existing tools. So I was wondering what you think is the importance of basic research and the development of new tools to stop the epidemics of AIDS, TB, and malaria.
So maybe, Mark, you can tell us whether, my understanding of the Global Fund is you don't support research, but if a product were to come through the pipeline and be endorsed, the Global Fund will pay for it. So how do you see Global Fund interacting with basic scientists of the kind that you're seeing here? Where is the pipeline for them to contribute to the Global Fund?
So this is a really important question. I think it's something we've been working closely on for the last 3 to 5 years, which is, from time of access to time of invention to time of access, so time of proof, not just the invention of the basic science, but the actual clinical trial that proves that you should use it and the guidance is in place, to use in a country, including, by the way, in the United States, Canada, and Europe, is about 10 years. So how do we collapse that down to 6 months to a year? So what we've begun doing is working actually with the innovation groups, whether it's the private sector, we're actually meeting with some of the industry here in Canada on this topic, whether or not it's vaccine developers, whether or not it's the Gates Foundation or Unitaid, which is a great organization. We're now co-planning with them so that when things change, we're ready to work with the countries to accelerate that change. And then Canada's invested in something called Wambo, which I think is an amazing tool. It's actually an online, it's like Kayak or Priceline or Amazon.com, which will allow any quality product for HIV, TB, and malaria, but we want to spin it off to a global public health good for any health commodity. You could actually see the Canadian health system using it over time. And that gives an automatic market and a rapid market, which is an incentive, like we are today, to create new products, to innovate, because anyone will have access to that as long as they have a quality product. But it will also allow for a flag, so if someone tries to order a drug that costs more or a diagnostic more than something else available, it'll actually be a flag, and it'll go to a supervisor if they continue to order it. But also if guidance changes and you try to order something old, a flag will go up and say, did you know that guidance has changed and you should now be using this? And someone might still have a good reason and enter it, but then a flag goes to the supervisor to say, hey, you're not doing the most important thing. So both by working with the producers up front and the manufacturers up front, but then also creating the innovation around the availability and access to markets, we're going to try to squeeze those times down because they really need to be squeezed. As much for, and this is what I love about the SDGs, for high-income countries, but we also need them for low-income countries.
I know Peter is itching to say something because you've been thinking a lot about why things transition to scale or don't, and what we can do to change the curve on that.
Sure, obviously you need to scale innovations to have impact, and innovation is the highway, impact is the destination. So that's the context of what we're talking about. I would say the Global Fund's extremely important for all kinds of innovation because you can't push a string. Normally when we're in innovation and research, you're thinking about the supply side. Even more important is the demand side, and the point that you are making, Madhu. Secondly, on the timeline question, yes, it can take 10 to 15 years if you have kind of upstream science, and that needs to be refreshed. But as we've been looking at the innovations in Grand Challenges Canada, the social and business innovations are actually very quick. They can be 2 years, they can be 3 years, and we were emphasizing the importance of delivery and access and innovation. Third point, just very quickly, an example from a sister fund, another pillar of global solidarity, the Global Finance Facility for Every Woman, Every Child. Financial innovation can help here. So there's a development impact bond in Cameroon, in the country plan, funded by the World Bank to scale up innovation earlier supported by Grand Challenges Canada on kangaroo mother care for premature babies. And then finally, I just wanted to go back to the Indigenous question. We're never going to solve the problems of Indigenous people. Indigenous people are going to solve the problems of Indigenous people. And the way they are going to do that is, I think, largely by innovating themselves. They're an incredibly creative people. They don't have the opportunities and the support to innovate, notwithstanding actually the excellent work in CIHR's Institute of Aboriginal People's Health. And I often lie in bed at night thinking, if Canada could do for its own Aboriginal people what it did for innovators in low and middle income countries, for example, in the $200 million investment in Grand Challenges Canada, that would be transformational because we support, yes, Canadian researchers, but primarily people in low and middle income countries to solve their own problems. And if you take that same outcome/deliverology/innovation-focused approach domestically, that, I think, ultimately is the way that the terrible, shameful burdens of health domestically in our Indigenous people will be solved.
Thank you. I think another great example is the link between TB Reach and the Global Fund. That if TB Reach is able to clearly demonstrate a very effective case-finding strategy, then it could go into the country concept notes and so on and so forth. So I think the openness of Global Fund to do these things, I think actually is wonderful to hear, and I'm hearing that from many different people. We're running over time, and we certainly want to give Minister Motsoaledi time on the agenda to talk about the amazing work South Africa is doing to change the epidemics of TB and HIV in their country. Can I have you on the stage, Minister Motsoaledi? Please come.
Thank you very much, facilitator. Let me thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important occasion and start by acknowledging my colleague, and thank her for welcoming me here in Canada, Minister Philpott. The last time we met, I was sharing a platform with her in the International AIDS Conference in South Africa. Please allow me not to talk only as a Minister of Health in South Africa about what we are doing about HIV and AIDS, but also in my capacity as a chairperson of the board of Stop TB Partnership, of which Lucic is the executive director. Canada has shown great leadership in hosting replenishment of the Global Fund, as well as funding the TB Reach initiative with $85 million, as the minister has already said. But let me answer the question, how can Canada help more? And of the 3 diseases, please allow me not to undermine the others, but to spend a little bit more time on TB. Because when I was made chairperson of Stop TB Partnership, I was told that my work is to make noise, and a lot of noise about TB. For the simple reason that it has been said here many times, that it looks like it's a little bit quieter on the front of TB than HIV/AIDS. Actually, that is true. That is very true. And what are the facts? I became the chairperson of Stop TB Partnership in 2013. I was actually elected in a board meeting here in Canada in 2013. I've been a member from 2010. In 2010, we had a retreat in Washington for 5 days to try and answer that very question. Why is it so quiet on the TB front than all the other diseases? And after 5 days of that retreat, we had no answers. In 2013, when we came to Ottawa in Canada, we even asked people who are experts and specialize in branding to try and tell us what should we do to try and brand TB in such a way that there's a lot of noise. There's a good reason why we're doing so. Number one, for the past 200 years, TB killed more people than HIV/AIDS, malaria, cholera, Ebola, bubonic plague, influenza, and polio, all of them added together. TB has killed more people than those. In 2014, TB overtook AIDS as the #1 killer of all the infectious diseases in the world. As I'm standing here in front of you, TB kills 1.5 million people per annum. In my country, South Africa, 80% of all HIV/AIDS deaths are actually attributable to TB. Now, we are aware that 9 million people get infected every year, and we are only able to identify 6 million. There are 3 million missing, but spreading the disease all over. As it said that one person with TB can infect 15 others. Now, those 3 million are the ones in which TB Reach, funded by Canada, is playing a big role, is to find that missing 3 million, and for which I really want to praise Canada, because it's the only country that up to so far that is funding TB Reach, and encourage them not to stop, because it helps us to fight the missing million. Lucigas here said, as long as you breathe, you are vulnerable to TB. Now, yes, I've said this many times, that any one of us can stand up on top of a mountain and shout that there will never be HIV positive, because you know what to do not to become HIV positive. But none of us can ever stand up and say, I will never get TB, because you can only say that if you stop breathing. And I'm sure there's nobody who's intending to stop breathing here in this meeting. So as long as we intend to continue breathing, we must know that we are vulnerable to TB. Now, what actions are needed? The first one is the advocacy, the noise that is being made. So for people to understand, I really don't want to waste your time in emphasizing that, but let me give you this story. At the height of the Ebola epidemic in South Africa, I don't know how many times I was hauled in front of Parliament to explain to honorable members and promise them that they are safe from Ebola in South Africa, because I've done everything, including closing the borders and all that, which is what they were demanding. But despite all my explanations, they were not satisfied. Some members of Parliament in opposition parties were even sneaking into hospitals and come back and tell Parliament, the minister is lying, I've been to this hospital, we're not ready to stop Ebola. I don't know what they were looking for in the hospital, but they will come back and say, yes, this minister was lying, I've been to this hospital, I don't think we are ready to stop Ebola. They kept on doing that. One day I shared the platform on national TV with the director of the National Institute of Communicable Diseases in South Africa. It's a very important institution, which is one of its own in the continent, and for the whole SADC countries. It was the only institution that had the capacity to diagnose Ebola during that pandemic. So the head of that institution, Professor Shabir Mahdi, said to South Africans, please, I know you are very scared of Ebola, but I want to assure you that it's in West Africa, about 5,000 kilometers away. From the way it's scientifically spread, the chance of it coming to South Africa are very slim. So if you want to get scared, please get scared of TB. That is the one that is going to kill you. I still remember how the public responded. They attacked him on Twitter, SMS, and one person even said, the fact that we are not professors doesn't mean we are fools. So don't try to make us fools. We know you are lying. Most probably the government bought you to protect them. They are not ready to protect us from Ebola, and so they want to divert us to this TB of yours. That's what happened that day. 12 months later, after that event, 12 months later, nobody got Ebola in South Africa, not to mention dying of Ebola. Nobody was infected with Ebola, but 40,000 South Africans died of TB. That still did not change anything. Zika came, I was hauled to Parliament again to talk about Zika now. Now, unfortunately, even the militant, we have got militants unions in South Africa in the mining sector. I was able to indicate to them that the biggest killer of mine workers, especially in gold mines, are not falling rocks and all that, it's TB. And in 1 year, after 80 people died of falling rocks in the mines and all the accidents that are unfortunate that happened there. After 80 people died, and we all heard about them, 1,500 mine workers died of TB. So it is a very big problem, and we need to do something about it. So the second thing I will really appeal to Canada is for the new mining laws. Yes, because if a person has got silicosis, especially from the gold mines, maybe let me start here. If a person is HIV positive, their chance of getting TB increases threefold. If they are diabetic, it increases about fivefold. If they've got silicosis, which is so common in gold mines, it increases sixfold. If they've got both HIV and silicosis, their chances increases 18-fold. So it will be very important for mine owners to make sure that they help to protect miners from this killer disease. I'm sure you are aware of the class action that is taking place in South Africa, where judges of the High Court have allowed mine workers to go and litigate against the disease they got in the mine. 56% of them, their problem are not the other things you think about in the mines. It's TB, which they got in the mines. And South Africa, having been the biggest gold-producing country, we are paying very dearly for that. So we have got special programs to make sure that all mine workers are screened. And all people staying around the mining dams are screened because they are very vulnerable. That is about TB. About AIDS, I'm sure Mark here has already mentioned it. And it was spoken about in the International HIV Conference, that while we are making inroads in other areas, we've got a very big problem among girls and young women between the ages of 15 and 24. In 14 Southern and Eastern African countries, research has shown that in this age group, the HIV pandemic is marching at the rate of 5,000 new infections per week. I heard the minister mentioning 15 new, 50 new infections per week in Canada. Yes, in 14 Southern and Eastern countries, African countries, is 5,000 new infections per week. And unfortunately, half of them are occurring in my own country. So we need a special focus because HIV/AIDS has been feminized, especially to young women. What is the focus? We've launched a big program which needs support, which has got 5 objectives. 1, reduce the incidence of HIV/AIDS in this age group. 2, reduce the incidence of teenage pregnancy in the age group because they go together. 3, keep these girls at school for as long as possible because it has been shown that if they stay at school much longer, they are protected. 4, reduce gender-based and sexual-based violence. And lastly, link them to skills and economic opportunities that will take away their dependency from men who promise them a better life but end up leaving them only with an unwanted pregnancy and infection with HIV. The issue of malaria, which is also a killer of children and pregnant women. Malaria is not necessarily a problem for, it's not a problem for everybody more than it is a problem for children and young women. I'm not trying to suggest that it can't kill men or all the other people, but the brand is borne by children and pregnant women on the African continent. In SADC, we've even formed what we call E8, Elimination Aid, because we think we can, and we are in a position to eliminate malaria if we work enough. Lastly, how can your university help? And how can Canada help? Lastly, all said and done, we're not going to defeat TB, malaria, and HIV/AIDS with science and medicine only. We also need social justice more than anything else. We need a world where there is justice, where there's fairness, where there is social solidarity in order to face these diseases. Otherwise, we are going to move in the same place. It's good that among the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we also said we need universal health care coverage. That is justice, that is fairness, and that is equity, and that is social solidarity. And I will really plead that whatever we are able to do to strengthen healthcare system, especially in developing countries. Look, I come from a continent where, and I think it's the only continent, and I'm very emotional about it because I don't like it. I come from a continent where when the head of state is sick, they must migrate to another continent because they can't get healthcare from their own continent because it has got weak healthcare system. That's very embarrassing. But unfortunately, leaders on my continent cannot see it, and they are not embarrassed by it. They just migrate and go to look for healthcare, leaving the population alone. That needs to be fought. And we are going to need the whole world to fight that type of a world because it's not a world based on justice, it's not a world based on fairness, and it cannot be a world that can defeat these scourges of the diseases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Motsoaledi. I think I speak for Luchika as well and all people working in TB. To have you as our champion advocate for TB has made a phenomenal difference. Not to speak of your impressive work in reversing the HIV epidemic in South Africa with antiretroviral rollout, which is now almost open to all South Africans with HIV, regardless of CD4 counts. So I will now open the floor for questions. I know we have people here from the media as well. So we have exactly 10 minutes for the final questions before we close. Questions from the floor? Can you please introduce yourself before asking the question? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm actually a McGill student. And I was very happy to hear the last speaker talk about social justice, and very glad to hear members of the panel see that ending AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria is a matter of health, but also a matter of political will. You named key populations that we need to target, including prostituted persons, particularly when we talk about risks for HIV/AIDS. And one might argue that the buyers, who are largely male, are the major source of disease transmission whose health behaviors ought to be a major research focus, as opposed to powerless people they exploit. What role do you think Canada has in addressing some of the major root causes, one of them being women's inequality, but also attached to racism and poverty, that make those key populations, such as prostituted people, more vulnerable to AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria?
Thank you. Dr. Philpott, do you want to take that?
Did you purposely give me the hardest one? First of all, I want to point out that the 4 questions that we've had from the floor have all come from young academic women, so kudos. Keep it up. One of the highlights of the AIDS conference for me was at the Canada booth meeting with young Canadian women researchers, and the future is bright, so women, keep at it. Let's make sure we change the figures on the role of women in research. So anyway, side point, I'm not trying to avoid the question. One of the previous UN AIDS directors, Peter Piot, one of the best things he ever said was that HIV has exposed the fault lines of society. And I often sort of think of that metaphor of the fault lines literally opening up and people falling through the cracks. And I think you answered your own question by talking about the fact that that it is those drivers of social justice. It is the stigma and discrimination associated with sex work. It's the gender inequity associated with the fact that that women and sometimes men are vulnerable to exploitation. That Indigenous Canadians walk into an emergency department and get stuck in a corner for hours on end, and the last person to be treated. So it really is those realities that Mark has talked about, the fact that we need to become better human beings, and we need to face the fact that until each and every person is treated with dignity and respect, and all human beings are actually treated as human beings, we won't be able to end the epidemic. So that doesn't sound like a very concrete question, but it's something that I think Canada is in a position to stand up for in a day where racism and discrimination are rampant around the world, and even actually still well rooted in Canada. That we need to say that it's unacceptable, and we in the academic and health communities are the people that need to be screaming that the loudest.
Thank you, Minister.
I guess I said I'm in the academic and health community. I'm actually in the political community, but I forgot.
Theta, very quick.
Yeah, very quickly. First of all, I think it's terrific that Canada is starting to focus on the women and girls agenda. And Karina Gould, who we'll hear from a little bit later, I think the parliamentary secretary, I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Frank Plummer, who was mentioned, when he did his seminal work on sex workers and the scientific work, less known, was also working on with those sex workers to help them find meaningful employment and leave sex work. And then finally, just to say that innovation can help, social innovation especially. We have 3 projects that are all quite similar that we supported because sometimes it's not professional sex work, it's just transactional sex. And one of them, for example, is called No Sugar for Me, and it's coaching young girls to have the skills to resist the influence of sugar daddies. And there's 3 of those, another one from the Harvard Negotiation Project, et cetera. So I just want to say, obviously there's social determinant issues here, there's social justice issues here. There's also some very pragmatic solutions of an innovative nature, often social innovations that Canada has supported, and I think will increasingly support as we focus on the women and girls agenda.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, please.
Yes, hello, I'm Damien Shadow. I'm the director of the World Federation of Science Journalists. We're an international organization with about 9,000 specialized journalists in 80 countries. I was just coming back on the public engagement side of one panelist alluded to the fact that AIDS and TB and malaria were off the media agenda in some territories. The reality is when we approach government agencies to try and train science communicators, science journalists, health journalists to better appraise, or non-specialized journalists actually, to better appraise scientific evidence, to access that evidence also, because that's one of the issues in a number of countries, to contextualize the whole health issue in the local culture and so on. The reality is that we cannot get money to build these projects around. We get money for Ebola, we get money for Zika. So perhaps the question is the reverse also. Where can we remind some of the stakeholders, perhaps not the ones around the panel right now, but some others that are part and parcel of the debate, to also bring in the public engagement side and communication up top of the agenda. We're all too willing. I mean, they're specialized journalists, so they know what they talk about.
Thank you.
But talk about the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there a response anyone has? I think it's an important point that we need to work with science journalists. Dr. Lauren and Alice, I can only take 2 questions. Lauren, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Lauren Dobson-Hughes, Executive Director of Results Canada. We're an advocacy organisation that works on international development. I was wondering if somebody could address the issue of how we take basic science and research and the role of advocacy in bridging that gap between research and political will. And I'm particularly interested in perhaps Minister Mazzoledi talking about his work with parliamentarians and the Global TB Caucus.
Minister Mazzoledi, would you like to respond to that?
Yes. Yes, I am also a co-chair of the Global TB Caucus because we thought in order to energize and make more noise about TB, members of parliament have to come on board. So the Global TB Caucus is for members of parliament. It has got 1,400 parliamentarians who have signed in about 100 countries. Just to give you an example of what they can give, one of the members of parliament who joined is a member of parliament from Kenya, Honorable Muko, who is now the co-chair of the Interparliamentary Caucus for Africa. He's also chairing the Portfolio Committee on Health in Kenya. And he told us that when the minister brought the budget to the Portfolio Committee, there was not even a single cent for TB on the budget. A disease which I've just said is now #1 killer. And now that's in Africa, it's in sub-Saharan Africa. And he said because he's a member of this Global TB Caucus, he knows he got the facts now. He rejected the budget and told the minister to go back to the drawing board and put some money for TB. Because in the continent of Africa, many believe TB will only be treated by donor funding without own resources inside that country. So members of parliament are able to fight and advocate and force ministers to put money from their own sources to fight TB, and that's a very good development.
I do hope you can get more Indian MPs on your caucus, because given 25% of the world's TB burden, India is barely spending 1% of its GDP on health. So miles to go before a highest TB burden country wakes up to its own realities. And speaking of media, we submitted an op-ed on TB in India to a leading Indian newspaper, got bumped off because of chikungunya that killed 2 people. And in those 2 days, India lost 2,000 people for TB because of TB. So just to tell you how challenging it is for floating up the priority, because whatever is the latest epidemic takes away. Dr. Chan, you get the last question, please.
Thank you. And I wish to thank the panel discussion. I really enjoyed it. And I thank you for organizing this symposium. So I'm a retired pediatrician. I have two questions and 1 comment. My first question is about what is the Canadian policy with rapid globalization? There are lots of people coming and going between countries. So how do we recommend screening for latent tuberculosis, especially for a young family? And the second point is how often you mentioned BCG vaccination is not very effective, and yet for those families who send children back to endemic country, like in China, I'm aware of, and would you recommend BCG vaccination or any other form of vaccination? And then my question about policy, about advocacy for at-risk population. And I think it's knowledge transfer is important to any at-risk group. So if there are problems about infection control or nutritional problem, I think we have to actively advocate by going to work with the individual communities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marcel, can you just very quickly respond, and then we can take it offline with Dr. Chan later over the cocktail on the technical guideline issue.
So there were 2 excellent questions there. The one was what to do about BCG vaccination of people who go back to countries that have BCG vaccination. And usually the goal there is not to protect somebody against the risk of tuberculosis in this neighborhood, but to harmonize their vaccine book so when they go back to their country of origin that they will at least get into school and somebody won't flag it. So generally that's supported to make sure that people are vaccinated according to their local guidelines. Pragmatically, to crack a vial of BCG in Canada to get 1 dose and lose 9 doses is actually very difficult. So often it's actually recommended to get vaccinated when you go home. In terms of people who come to Canada, who should and who should not be screened for latent tuberculosis infection, there are Canadian guidelines that go into all the various different situations, and they relate to age, the type of immigrant you are, the incidence of the country you're from, if you're an immigrant or if you're a refugee, and essentially, the main driver of that is a decision to test should be a decision to treat. So we shouldn't just be screening people if we don't have the mechanisms to actually follow up on the test and do something with the result. And so each group has to be, followed according to those guidelines, and I can tell you the details, of course, offline. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. So it is now my pleasure to close this panel. This is a huge day for McGill University to have this level of global health leadership come here and spend some time with us. Thank you, all of you. You guys were amazing. Thank you. I know there are some media people in the room who might want some time with you for a media interview. Some of you have received invitations for a cocktail, which is at the Faculty Club, where we will have Karina Gold, as well as the chair of the Global Fund, speaking to us briefly. So there are volunteers who will take you across this traffic chaos to the Faculty Club. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.